usually, when you look at history, you kind of treat it like a museum exhibit, you know?
Right. Like something safely behind glass.
Exactly. You walk past the glass case, you see a clay pot or, like, a list of ancient kings.
You read the little placard that summarizes 1,000 years in 2 sentences.
Right, and you just move on because it feels safe. It feels distant.
It definitely creates this psychological barrier.
Yeah.
Because when history is just data on a page, you really don't have to reckon with the reality that these ancient figures had the exact same emotional capacity that you do today.
But then you encounter a text that just forces you to realize these were breathing, sweating, grieving human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly that museum glass just completely shatters.
Yeah, you realize you are not just looking at a timeline anymore. You are looking at a mirror.
Which is, I mean, that's the absolute definition of stepping out of the museum and into the actual gritty dust of human history.
Absolutely.
So, welcome back to Between the Verses, where curiosity meets scripture. I'm Daniel.
And I'm Hannah.
And if you are joining us for the first time today, welcome to the show.
We are so glad you're here.
We really are. We are currently in Series 2, which is called The Beginning of Humanity Outside Eden.
And if you missed Series 1, I mean, I highly encourage you to go back and check it out.
Oh, for sure. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, and now we're actually on Apple Podcasts, too.
Which is super exciting. But yeah, we covered so much ground in those early chapters, and I promise you will not regret taking the time to catch up.
It'll just bring you completely up to speed on the world we are stepping into today.
Right, because everything we discuss on this show comes straight from our own individual Bible reading, our study notes, and the questions that send us down these massive research rabbit holes.
So many rabbit holes.
Too many.
Yeah.
But the entire mission of the show is to encourage the Bible to be a real, living force in your life.
Not just an old book of ancient scroll.
Exactly. I mean, when you stop and think about the fact that these texts have survived millennia.
True.
Like, empires have risen and fallen, entire languages have completely died out, but this text remains. If that is not God's hand at work, we honestly just don't know what is.
No, absolutely. So today's deep dive is going to be significantly longer than our usual ones.
Buckle up.
Yeah. Seriously, because there is just an immense amount to unpack here. And the irony is that we are looking at Genesis chapter 5 today.
Right.
For most readers, this is the chapter you breeze through in about 2 minutes.
It is the ultimate skip-ahead chapter.
It really is. You see a block of text filled with hard-to-pronounce names and gigantic numbers, and your brain just kind of glosses over it.
Yeah, on the surface, it looks like a completely dry genealogy.
It's a list of names.
Because you get through the gripping drama of Cain and Abel in chapter 4, right?
Oh, that was intense.
Super intense. And then you just want to get to the epic cinematic narrative of Noah and the flood in chapter 6.
Right, you want the boat and the animal.
Exactly. So chapter 5 just feels like a speed bump, like this mandatory list of ancestors you just have to endure.
But we are pulling the urgency brake today.
Yes, we are.
We are slowing way down, because when you stop treating this chapter like a speed bump, you uncover massive amounts of humanity, history, and like even biology hiding right there in plain sight.
So let's start with the very first verses, because the text actually takes us backward before it moves us forward.
Right.
Moses, who compiled this text, he hits the pause button right before listing all these descendants.
Just to remind you of one specific thing.
Exactly. He reminds us that humanity originated in the image of God.
So let's look at why that matters in this specific moment in the narrative. Because, you know, Adam and Eve have already been exiled from Eden.
The fall has happened.
Cain has murdered his brother Abel in cold blood. By all metrics, humanity is off to a catastrophic start outside the garden.
A total disaster.
Right. If you were reading this as a first-time observer, you might assume that whatever divine spark humanity had in Eden was entirely extinguished by their rebellion.
I would absolutely assume that. I mean, sin enters the picture, the ground is literally cursed, humans are turning on each other.
It looks like a failed experiment.
It really does. I'd assume the image of God was forfeited the exact moment Adam ate the fruit.
Right. But Scripture makes a massive theological claim here by explicitly restating that God created mankind in his likeness right at the start of this post-Eden genealogy.
It's so intentional.
It is. It's proving that despite the fall, despite the rebellion and the murder, the image of God in humanity was damaged, sure, but it was not erased.
I like to think of it like a shattered mirror.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. Before the fall, humanity perfectly reflected the Creator. But sin dropped the mirror. The glass completely shattered.
It's all in pieces.
It's fractured, it is sharp, it is broken. But if you look into the shards on the floor, the reflection is still there.
Wow, yeah.
Humanity still possesses an inherent dignity and a divine imprint that separates them from the rest of the animal kingdom.
That brings up a very specific shift in the text, though. Because in Genesis chapter 1, mankind is made in God's image.
Right.
But in chapter 5, verse 3, it says that Adam became father to his son Seth in his own likeness, according to his image.
Yes.
So what is the text communicating here? Is it just saying Seth inherited Adam's broken, sinful nature? Or is there like a physical reality being described?
Well, theologians traditionally focus on the transmission of the fallen human nature, which is deeply important, obviously.
Sure.
Seth inherited mortality from Adam. He wasn't born in the pristine, unfallen state that Adam originally enjoyed.
Right, he was born into the curse.
Exactly. But if we look at this simply as an ancient historical family record, we cannot ignore the physical implications.
Because in modern terms, when a baby is born, we use this exact language all the time.
We really do.
You go to the hospital, you look in the bassinet and you say, oh my gosh, he is the spitting image of his father.
Right. You don't mean he inherited his father's philosophical worldview.
No, you mean they have the same nose.
Exactly. So let's pursue that line of thought for a second. Notice that this phrase, in his likeness, according to his image, is never used to describe Cain.
Wow.
And it is never used for Abel. It is exclusively attached to Seth.
That's fascinating.
It strongly implies a striking physical resemblance. Like, did Seth have Adam's exact build? Did he have his facial structure, the same cadence to his voice?
Imagine you are Seth just walking around these early human settlements.
Right.
Everywhere you go, people who know Adam just stop in their tracks because you look like a younger clone of the very first man who ever lived.
That would be wild.
It would be an incredible psychological burden, honestly, but also a profound comfort to his parents.
Let's focus on that comfort for a moment, because Abel was brutally murdered. Cain is a fugitive wandering the earth.
Adam and Eve had utterly lost their boys.
They really had, and then God grants them Seth, whose very name actually means appointed or granted.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so for Seth to look exactly like Adam would serve as a daily visual reminder of God's grace to that specific family.
Wow.
It was a literal reflection of their beginning, a sign that their lineage and the promise of a redeemer was actually going to continue.
Okay, so let's talk about the timeline of that continuation.
Right.
Because Genesis states Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born.
Right.
Now, when I hear that someone had a child at 130, I am immediately checking the math.
It sounds impossible.
It really does. I am picturing a frail person in a hospital bed trying to hold a newborn. It fundamentally clashes with everything we know about human biology today.
Well, yeah, because we inherently map our current 80-year biological lifespans onto the Genesis
I
narrative.
just can't help it.
We can't. But to understand this text, you have to completely deconstruct how you view time and aging.
Okay, unpack that.
You have to go back to the original design. God originally created mankind to live forever. Death was an invader. It was a consequence. So, if there was no death before sin entered the world, we have to ask a profound biological question. Did aging even exist in the Garden of Eden?
Man, that concept completely short-circuits my brain.
It's hard to grasp.
If you never died, you age. Are you just in a perpetual state of 25 years old?
Well, to answer that, you have to look at the mechanism of aging. Aging is essentially cellular entropy.
Okay, science time.
Yeah, entropy is a scientific principle describing the gradual decline into disorder.
Right. Things break down.
Exactly. In our bodies, every time a cell divides and replicates, the DNA gets a tiny bit frayed at the ends. These are called telomeres.
Okay.
Over decades, those telomeres shorten. The cells can't replicate perfectly anymore, and your body degrades. You get wrinkles, your organs weaken, your bones lose density.
But if Adam and Eve's genetic code in Eden was flawless-like, created directly by the hand of God and sustained by the tree of life, that cellular degradation simply wouldn't happen.
The cellular replication would be 100% perfect every single time. There is no entropy.
What?
Which means there is no biological point of reference for time in the way we experience it. You don't celebrate birthdays if you don't have a biological expiration date, you know?
That makes total sense. You don't measure the passage of time on a body that never changes.
Right. So imagine you are Adam or Eve. You have an existence with no timeline. You aren't 30 or 50. You just exist in perfect maturity.
But then the fall happens. You are exiled from the garden.
Yep.
The flaming sword cuts off access to the tree of life. So, did the biological clock of aging only begin ticking the exact moment they stepped out of Eden?
Logically, yes. If death entered the world through sin, then the process of dying, which is exactly what aging actually is, must have begun at that exact moment.
That is so intense to think about.
The day they were exiled from the garden was essentially year one as far as their bodies were concerned. That is the moment God flipped the hourglass.
So when the text says Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, that is 130 years of biological ticking. But because his body was still so incredibly close to its original perfect design, 130 wasn't ancient. His cells were barely beginning to experience the effects of entropy.
He might have looked and felt the way a 30-year-old does today.
And that hourglass had an incomprehensible amount of sand in it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because right after noting Seth's birth, the text casually drops the fact that Adam lived for another 800 years.
We compress 800 years into one sentence when we read this chapter, but you really have to sit with that number to feel its weight.
8 centuries.
It's massive.
To put that in perspective for you today, the United States of America is not even 300 years old yet.
Wow. That really puts it in perspective.
Right. If you go back 800 years from right now, you are in the 1200s. We're talking about the height of the Middle Ages.
Wow.
The Magna Carta was just signed. Genghis Khan is building his empire.
That's just wild to think about.
Imagine one single human being living from the era of knights in shining armor, all the way to smartphones, artificial intelligence, and space travel.
That is the lifespan of one man in Genesis 5.
And within that massive expanse of time, the text simply notes that Adam had other sons and daughters.
Just a casual footnote.
Yeah, that one brief phrase covers centuries of pregnancies, births, marriages, family feuds, grief, and immense societal expansion.
Multiple generations were being born, growing up, and having their own children while Adam was still alive.
Which forces us to confront a topic that makes modern readers very, very uncomfortable.
Yes, we have to talk about who these early humans were actually marrying.
Because Cain had a wife. Seth had a wife.
And Adam and Eve were the first and only human beings created.
So the undeniable biological reality here is that Cain and Seth married their sisters, or perhaps their nieces.
We are talking about extremely close family reproduction.
Yeah. And critics of the biblical narrative frequently point to this as a major flaw in the text.
All the time. Today, if siblings were to marry and reproduce, it carries immense, devastating genetic risks.
It often leads to severe congenital defects and diseases.
Consequently, it is legally and morally forbidden across the globe, as it should be today.
Right. But modern readers project that current biological reality back onto Genesis and conclude the story is absurd.
So let's break down the actual biology of why close family reproduction is dangerous today, so we can contrast it with the ancient world.
Okay, lay it on me.
Today, the human genome is basically like a photocopy of a photocopy that has been passed around and copied again for thousands of years.
It gets degraded.
Exactly. It is full of genetic mutations, errors, and recessive traits.
Okay.
Now, if you reproduce with someone completely unrelated to you, your healthy genes usually mask their genetic errors, and vice versa.
That makes sense.
But if you reproduce with a close sibling, you share the exact same genetic errors. When you combine two sets of the same mutations, the offspring suffer the tragic defects.
Right, that is the biological reality of entropy thousands of years after the fall.
Exactly. But you have to view the early years of humanity through a completely different biological lens.
Because they started perfect.
Yes. Adam and Eve were created genetically perfect. They possessed the original masterprint genome.
So even after the fall, their immediate descendants were vastly closer to physical perfection than we are today.
The genetic code was pure. It hadn't yet accumulated thousands of years of mutations.
So from a purely biological standpoint, there were literally no genetic defects to compound.
None.
A brother and sister could reproduce without any risk of congenital disease because the recessive genetic errors simply did not exist yet.
Exactly. Furthermore, from a theological standpoint, God allowed it out of sheer necessity.
Because who else are they going to marry?
Right. There were literally no other human beings on the planet. If humanity was going to fulfill the divine mandate to be fruitful and multiply, they had no alternative but to marry within the immediate family.
It was just a unique, unrepeatable era of history.
It was. And you'll notice that centuries later, during the time of Moses, God strictly outlaws incest in the book of Leviticus.
Oh, that's a great point. Why the change?
because the genetic conditions of humanity had degraded to a point where it was no longer safe, and the societal necessity was gone because the Earth was populated.
That context makes complete sense. But, setting the biology aside, I want to dive into the emotional and psychological dynamics of this extending family, particularly regarding Cain.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Cain wasn't just a brother. He was the outcast older brother who committed the first murder in human history.
Right, he was exiled to the land of Nod, further to the east.
He wasn't living in the immediate family compound with Seth and the younger siblings.
So consider the psychological toll of that scenario. You have this rapidly expanding family over centuries. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are building early civilization.
And there is this dark, unspoken shadow hanging over the entire family tree.
Imagine you are one of Adam and Eve's younger children. You were born decades, maybe a century after Abel was murdered.
You never even met Abel.
Exactly. But you hear the whispers in the tents at night. You know you have an older brother out there somewhere.
He is the cautionary tale living out in the wilderness.
Imagine a family gathering where you pull your father Adam aside and ask, why don't we ever travel east? Why doesn't our oldest brother ever come visit?
Wow. The grief for Adam and Eve would be perpetual.
It would just never end.
They couldn't just move on from the tragedy because Cain was still out there building his own society, alienated from the presence of God and from his family.
Every time Eve looked at Seth, she would be reminded of the son she lost to violence and the son she lost to exile.
And as this family is reproducing and expanding across the landscape, there is another dark shadow hanging over every single birth.
What's that?
It goes all the way back to the promise God made in the garden, the promise of death.
Oh, right.
And that promise really dictates the entire literary structure of Genesis chapter 5.
It does. When you read this genealogy, you immediately realize it is built on a very strict rhythmic pattern.
It operates like a metronome.
It lists the patriarch, the exact age he had his first-named child, how long he lived after that birth, the fact that he had other sons and daughters, and then the total length of his life.
And then every single entry ends with the exact same phrase over and over again. And then he died.
It is a haunting refrain. It acts as a drumbeat echoing through the entire chapter.
Seth lived 912 years, and then he died.
Enoch lived 905 years, and then he died.
Moses is not just giving us a boring list of statistics. He is making a profound theological point about the inescapable reality of the curse.
What strikes me is the sheer inevitability of it all.
Yeah.
It didn't matter if you lived to be 800 or 900 or like Methuselah, 969 years old. No matter how incredibly long they stretched out their time on Earth, death eventually caught them.
You cannot outlive the consequences of sin.
Reflect deeply on Adam's experience here. He lived 930 years.
It's a long time to think.
For over 9 centuries, he walked the earth with God's sentence hanging heavily over his head. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die.
He watched his descendants be born. He watched civilization begin. He watched the invention of agriculture and music.
But he knew, deep in his bones, that his biological clock was winding down.
When his lungs finally took their last breath and his body returned to the dust from which it was made, it served as the absolute, undeniable proof to his entire family that God's word is absolute.
But even in the midst of that graveyard, hope is sneaking in.
Yes, it is. Because the line of Seth survived. They kept having children.
And because they kept reproducing, God's promise of a redeemer survived too.
The seed of the woman that God promised would eventually crush the serpent's head. That specific lineage was marching forward step by step through the cemetery of Genesis 5.
That is the beautiful tension of this chapter. Death is reigning over humanity, claiming every single patriarch, but life is stubbornly pushing through.
The promise is being passed like a baton from one generation to the next, even as the runners eventually collapse.
Now, we need to spend some serious time exploring these massive lifespans. We mentioned Seth living 912 years, Enoch 905, Jared 962, and Methuselah 969.
But look at when they were having their children.
Right.
Mahalalel becomes a father at 65, Kenan at 70, Enoch at 90, Seth at 105, Adam at 130.
A lifespan of almost a millennium changes absolutely everything we know about human biology, maturity, and societal structure.
It really does. There is a very common argument among skeptics who read these numbers and try to rationalize them to fit our modern understanding of biology.
Oh, I've heard this one.
They argue that ancient people just tracked time differently. They suggest that these aren't literal solar years, but perhaps they represent symbolic seasons or even just months.
Which sounds like a neat scientific way to explain it away until you actually apply that logic to the text.
Right, because if you assume a year in Genesis 5 actually means a month, the math creates scenarios that are biologically absurd.
Let's test that theory right now. Mahalalel had his first child at 65 years old. If those are actually months, that means he became a father when he was 5.5 years old.
That's ridiculous.
Enoch would have become a father at 5.5 years old. Kenan would have been a father before his 6th birthday.
Yeah, the text completely falls apart if you try to interpret these numbers as months or seasons.
It really does.
The most intellectually honest way to read the ancient text is to take it at its word. These were literal solar years.
Which means we have to accept a paradigm shift. The human body back then was fundamentally biologically different in its resilience.
I love the analogy of the wind-up toy for this.
Oh yeah, explain that.
So think of the human body as a brilliantly crafted wind-up toy. It was wound so tightly with such perfect frictionless mechanics by the creator in Eden that even after it was dropped on the floor and dented by the fall, it still took nearly 1,000 years for the mainspring to finally wind down.
That's such a great visual.
The effects of God's perfect design were just slowly fading over generations. It wasn't an immediate plunge into 80-year lifespans. It was a gradual, multi-generational decline.
And that biological pacing raises a fascinating question about maturity. If you live to be 900 years old, how does your body pace its growth?
Right.
In 1 Corinthians 7.36, Paul talks about the bloom of youth, that period of life when a person reaches full physical maturity and the height of their reproductive vitality.
Today, we map that onto our late teens and 20s.
But in Genesis 5, if people aren't having their first children until they are 65 or 105 or 130, does that mean puberty and physical maturity happen much later in life?
We obviously don't have the explicit physiological data, but the text strongly implies a proportional stretching of life stages.
Right. Today, we consider a dog to age roughly 7 years for every 1 human year.
Apply that kind of scaling to the Genesis patriarchs. You weren't an old, frail man at 80 back then. You were barely entering your prime.
Let's think about brain development for a second. Today, science tells us the human frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for complex decision-making and risk assessment, isn't fully developed until age 25.
Yeah.
So if your lifespan is stretched out to 900 years, does your brain take 100 years to fully develop?
Are you essentially a reckless teenager until you hit 120?
The accumulation of life experience before you even reach biological middle age would be staggering.
Oh, absolutely.
You would have centuries to master a craft, to study the environment, to observe the consequences of societal choices.
Put this in a modern career analogy. Imagine graduating college at 60.
Wow.
You spend a few decades in an entry-level job, you finally hit 150 years old, you buy your first house, and you think, I really feel like I'm finally coming into my own as an adult. I'm ready to settle down, maybe find a wife and start a family.
It completely upends our paradigm of what a human life looks like.
It totally does.
And because people were living so incredibly long and continuing to have children for centuries, the structure of the family tree looked nothing like what we picture today.
Right. Today, we view a family tree like a relay race.
Great-grandmother runs her leg of the race, she passes the baton to the next generation, and then she steps off the track. One generation replaces the other.
But in Genesis 5, the family tree wasn't a sequential relay race. It was a massive, overlapping, intensely complex web.
If you look closely at the numbers, almost everyone listed in this chapter was alive at the exact same time.
Let's draw this out for you. If you were to take a piece of graph paper and draw horizontal lines representing the lifespans of these men based on the exact ages given in the text, you would realize that 8, 9, or even 10 generations were all living and breathing simultaneously.
Adam lived for 930 years. That means Adam was alive to see the birth of his son Seth.
He saw his grandson Enoch.
He saw his great-grandson Kenan.
He lived to see Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, and Lamech. Adam lived long enough to personally know the father of Noah.
This point simply cannot be overstated when we talk about how ancient history was preserved.
No, it's crucial.
We have to remember, there was no written Bible yet. There were no leather scrolls of Genesis being passed around the tents.
The history of the world, the knowledge of God, and the truth of creation were preserved entirely through oral tradition and eyewitness testimony.
And the ultimate eyewitness to the very beginning of the universe was still physically present at the family gatherings for nearly a millennium.
Adam wasn't ancient history to these people. He wasn't a mythical character in a storybook.
No.
He was great-great-great-grandpa living a few valleys over.
Imagine sitting around a fire on a clear, starry night. Sitting across from you is a man whose face carries the weight of 9 centuries.
Yeah.
And someone asks, Grandpa Adam, tell us about the garden again. Tell us what it felt like to walk on ground that wasn't cursed with thorns. Tell us what the voice of the Creator sounded like when he walked in the cool of the day.
The theological and historical continuity there is staggering. The people of Genesis 5 didn't have to take the story of Eden purely on blind faith from distant ancestors playing a millennia-long game of telephone.
They could go ask the man who literally named the animals.
They could look at his hands. They could hear the profound regret in his voice when he talked about the serpent and the fruit.
The truth of God's perfect creation and the agonizing tragedy of the fall were living, breathing realities within their immediate extended family.
And within that massive overlapping family structure, you start to notice certain cultural patterns.
Like what?
Well, if you compare the genealogy of Cain's ungodly line in chapter 4 with the righteous line of Seth in chapter 5, you see a recurrence of specific names.
Yes, this is a fascinating detail. In Cain's lineage, you have a man named Enoch and a man named Lamech.
Then over in Seth's lineage, you also have a man named Enoch and a man named Lamech.
We see name repetition in our own families today, so it could simply be that these were common, popular names in the ancient world. But Hebrew narrative is incredibly intentional. Nothing is wasted. This might be a literary technique to directly contrast the two diverging bloodlines of humanity.
Let's look at the contrast. Cain's Lamech was a boastful polygamist who wrote a poem celebrating his own violence and murder.
Seth's Lamech was a man of hope who looked at his son Noah and prophesied comfort for a cursed earth.
Cain's Enoch had an entire city named after him, tying his legacy entirely to the dirt and brick of human achievement.
But Seth's Enoch, his destiny was entirely unique. He wasn't tied to the dirt at all.
Right in the middle of this repetitive timeline of death, where the inescapable drumbeat is, and then he died, and then he died, the pattern completely shatters.
Genesis 5, verse 24. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him.
You were reading along, anticipating the phrase, and then he died, and suddenly the text veers off a cliff.
It is one of the most mysterious, abrupt, and beautiful verses in all of Scripture.
Enoch lived 365 years. Now, to us, that sounds ancient.
Oh, definitely.
But in the context of his peers, who were living to be 900, his life was incredibly short. He was cut off in the absolute prime of his life. He was essentially a young man by antediluvian standards.
Now, antediluvian simply means before the flood. It comes from the Latin ante, meaning before, and diluvium, meaning deluge or flood.
Got it.
And the text contrasts Enoch's life in this pre-flood world with the rest of humanity by using a very specific phrase. He walked with God.
We really need to define what that actually means, because it's become a bit of a cliche in modern religious language.
Right, like we say it all the time without thinking about it.
The text doesn't just say Enoch believed in God. It doesn't say he was a generally moral guy who obeyed the rules.
Walking with someone implies daily, intimate, side-by-side fellowship. It is a relationship of proximity.
It implies you're going in the exact same direction, at the exact same pace.
It requires an active, relentless pursuit of the presence of God. Enoch's fellowship with the Creator was so intimate, so profoundly aligned, that God simply removed him from the earth without him having to cross the threshold of physical death.
Hebrews chapter 11 gives us a bit of commentary on this, actually, noting that before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God.
But the lingering question is why? Why did God take him then? Why not let him live out his 900 years walking with God on earth?
To understand the timing of Enoch's departure, we have to look at the broader historical context of what was happening in the world during his 365 years.
Things were getting bad.
Really bad. The earth was rapidly degrading. Violence was multiplying exponentially. The ungodly line of Cain was spreading its influence, building cities, forging weapons, and corrupting the human experience.
So it was essentially a rescue mission.
Yeah.
God looked at the spiritual toxicity that was enveloping the earth and essentially said, you are too pure for this place. You don't belong here anymore. Come home.
And to truly grasp the terrifying depth of the darkness that Enoch was rescued from, we have to touch on a text that many listeners have probably heard of in passing, but might not fully understand.
You're talking about the Book of Enoch.
The Book of Enoch, yes. It is an ancient Jewish religious work ascribed by tradition to this very Enoch we are discussing.
Now, let's be extremely clear on our stance here, because we want to be helpful to you as you navigate biblical history. This book is not in the modern Western biblical canons.
Right. You won't find it in the Protestant Bible, the Catholic Bible, or the Standard Orthodox Bibles.
However, it is important to note that it is fully canonized in the Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Bibles.
Why is that?
Well, because those specific Christian communities were geographically and culturally isolated in the Horn of Africa for centuries, allowing them to preserve ancient texts and traditions that were lost, debated, or discarded by the Roman and Byzantine branches of the early church.
Wow. And furthermore, the New Testament writer Jude actually quotes directly from the Book of Enoch in his epistle.
Which is a detail that always makes people pause. A biblical, inspired writer quoting a non-biblical book.
It's wild, but what the Book of Enoch does is fill in massive, expansive gaps about the cultural and spiritual climate of this specific era.
Specifically, it goes into terrifying detail regarding fallen angels, known as the Watchers.
According to this ancient text, these Watchers came down to earth, interacted with humanity, taught them forbidden, destructive knowledge like the making of weapons of war, cosmetics, and sorcery, and ultimately corrupted the human bloodline.
It paints a picture of an earth that was becoming an absolute nightmare of supernatural and human evil merging together.
And we don't have to call the Book of Enoch inspired canon to heavily value the cultural and historical context it provides.
Not at all.
It shows us exactly what the Jewish people in the first century believed was happening in the days leading up to Noah's flood. They didn't view it as just a time when humans were acting a bit immoral. They viewed it as an era of total cosmic rebellion.
And placing Enoch in that specific context makes his walk with God even more stunning.
Yeah.
He was maintaining perfect intimacy and purity with the Creator, while the rest of the world was literally consorting with fallen angels and plunging into absolute depravity.
No wonder God spared him from witnessing the climax of that horror.
Exactly. Enoch was taken, but his descendants remained behind to face what was coming. He had a son named Methuselah, famous for being the oldest man who ever lived at 969 years.
And Methuselah had a son named Lamech. And Lamech's specific lifespan and life choices really hint at a massive shift that is about to rock the entire world.
Lamech is a deeply fascinating figure in this timeline. He lives to be exactly 777 years old.
777. In biblical numerology, the number 7 is highly symbolic.
It represents completion, perfection, or a divine cycle coming to an end.
It is a striking number. But pay attention to the fact that his lifespan is significantly shorter than his father Methuselah's 969 years, or his grandfather Enoch's contemporaries.
It raises an intriguing question. Is Lamech's 777-year lifespan the initial indicator of humanity's biological decline?
Are the environmental conditions of the Earth already changing? Becoming more hostile to human longevity even before the floodwaters break?
Some theorists suggest changes in atmospheric pressure or increased solar radiation degrading the genetic code faster.
We obviously can't know the exact mechanism, but Lamech's body gives out 2 centuries earlier than his forefathers.
Yet the most pivotal thing Lamech does in his 777 years is have a son. He names this boy Noah.
And he utters a profound prophecy over him. He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed.
Lamech intimately knows the agony of the curse. He feels the physical weight of farming a stubborn, thorn-infested earth.
And he looks at his baby boy and prophetically declares that this child is going to bring relief to humanity.
But right after Noah is introduced, we had another bizarre biological anomaly in the timeline.
Oh, this one is crazy. The text tells us that Noah doesn't have kids until he is 500 years old.
Let's compare that to the established pattern. Mahalalel had kids at 65, Enoch at 65, Lamech had Noah at 182.
Everyone in this genealogy is starting their families between 65 and 180 years of age.
But Noah waits until he is half a millennium old. That is a massive, glaring outlier.
Why did he wait? Was he physically unable to have children for centuries?
Did he choose a life of celibacy in a wicked world until God commanded otherwise?
Or was God intentionally suppressing Noah's ability to build a family?
I lean heavily toward the intentional delay by God, and it has to do with the grim logistics of the impending flood.
Okay, unpack that.
Consider the math of human reproduction over centuries. If Noah had started having children at 100 years old, like his ancestors. By the time he reached 600, which is the exact year the flood came, he would have possessed a massive, sprawling family tree.
He would have had hundreds, perhaps thousands of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren.
But God's plan was only to save 8 people on the ark: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives.
Oh, wow. If Noah had possessed a massive extended family, he would have had to endure the unimaginable psychological trauma of building an ark, closing the door, and listening to thousands of his own direct biological descendants drown in the rising waters.
By delaying Noah's fertility until he was 500 years old, God was actually demonstrating profound preemptive mercy.
That is incredible.
He was keeping Noah's family unit small, tight, and manageable enough to fit entirely on the ark, sparing him the horror of leaving his own grandchildren behind to die.
God's timing, even when it looks like a painful delay or a biological anomaly, is always executing a perfect purpose.
The precision of God's timing really is incredible. And if we look at timing, I want to circle back to the overlap with Adam we discussed earlier, because this is where the preservation of truth in Genesis 5 becomes so moving.
Yes, we know from the dates given that Adam died exactly 126 years before Noah was born.
Which means the first man whose sin broke the world, and the man who would be tasked with restarting the world after the flood, never actually crossed paths. They never met.
But Noah's father, Lamech, and Noah's grandfather, Methuselah, overlapped with Adam for decades.
If you plot the numbers, Lamech was 56 years old when Adam died. Methuselah was 243 years old when Adam died.
Think about the chain of custody for the truth of God. The history of Eden, the uncorrupted truth of God's original design, passed through barely any hands before reaching Noah.
Adam personally told Methuselah and Lamech. Methuselah and Lamech personally told Noah.
The chain of truth was unbroken. In a world that was plunging into total spiritual darkness, consorting with fallen angels and embracing violence, God ensured that the man who would build the ark had direct, virtually first-hand knowledge of who God was and what he required.
He wasn't relying on a corrupted myth. He had the testimony of the garden passed down across a single dinner table.
It is a brilliant demonstration of God preserving a remnant. We know exactly how long Adam lived to testify to this truth. We know exactly when he died.
But as we comb through this exhaustive genealogy, there is a glaring, heartbreaking silence regarding the other half of humanity's origin.
We have to talk about the unwritten epilogue of Eve.
Yeah.
The Bible is entirely, completely silent on when Eve died. We don't know her age. We don't know if she outlived Adam or if Adam had to bury the only woman he ever knew.
She is granted the title, the Mother of All the Living, and yet her final chapter is left completely blank in the historical record.
When you pause and dwell on the emotional reality of Eve's life, it is profoundly traumatic.
As readers, we so often judge Eve for taking the fruit, but we rarely empathize with the centuries of psychological pain she endured afterward.
Think of the crushing weight of her guilt. She was the one who was deceived by the serpent. She was the one who handed the fruit to Adam.
For hundreds of years, every single time she saw a thistle grow in the dirt, every time she felt a physical pain, every time she heard news of a murder or an act of violence in the expanding cities of men, she knew exactly where it started.
She was the literal origin point for human suffering.
Imagine the conversations she must have endured. Imagine her descendants, generations down the line, coming to her in anger, grief, or confusion.
Imagine a great-granddaughter whose husband was just murdered looking at Eve and asking, "Why did you eat it? Why did you listen to the serpent? You lived in a paradise without death. Why did you throw it away?"
And imagine them turning to Adam. Adam, why did you listen to Eve when the Creator had spoken the rule directly to you?
The psychological burden of carrying the blame for a degrading world is just unimaginable.
It really is.
But I like to paint a picture of Adam and Eve growing old together. For over 900 years, they leaned on each other. They were the only two humans who knew what perfect innocence felt like, which meant they were the only two who truly understood what was lost.
They survived the agonizing exile. They survived the murder of their second-born by their firstborn. They watched the horrific consequences of their choice ripple out into an empire of flesh built by Cain's ungodly lineage.
Yet amidst all that trauma, they also witnessed God's profound, enduring mercy.
They held Seth in their arms. They watched their descendants call upon the name of the Lord.
They saw Enoch walk so closely with God that he was taken directly into the unseen realm. They saw the lineage of faith survive against all odds.
Eve must have looked at her sprawling, messy, broken, but beautiful family tree and realized that even in a world infected with death, God's promise was still true.
Hope remained alive. the seed of the woman was still coming.
That is the beautiful, agonizing tension of Genesis chapter 5. It is a massive, centuries-long tug-of-war between expanding humanity and growing darkness.
It is life and death wrestling for dominance over the course of a millennium. And that exact tension sets up the most dramatic turning point in all of human history.
Because the darkness was about to reach a tipping point that God could no longer tolerate.
So let's summarize the immense ground we've covered today. Genesis 5 is not just a dry list of names you should skim over to get to the action of the flood.
It is a deeply human saga.
It is the story of massive overlapping families sharing the eyewitness testimony of Eden.
It is the story of physical perfection slowly fading, the biological realities of a world unmarred by genetic decay, and the haunting rhythmic reality that the wages of sin is inevitably death.
But above all, it is the story of a faithful God perfectly preserving the line of hope through Seth, Enoch, Lamech, and eventually Noah.
It acts as the crucial bridge that carries the promise of redemption safely over the dark rising waters of human depravity.
And if we are talking about dark waters, you are not going to want to miss our next deep dive. We are pivoting to Genesis chapter 6, and I promise you it gets incredibly juicy.
It is arguably one of the most controversial, bizarre, and fiercely debated chapters in the entire biblical canon.
We are going to be diving headfirst into the mystery of the sons of God. Yes, we are tackling the fallen angels debate.
We will be exploring the Nephilim, the legendary giants of the ancient world.
We will look at the profound, staggering heartbreak of God's regret over making humanity and the specific calling of Noah to build a boat on dry land.
Lots of tea is coming your way, so you got to come back to hear all about it.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, please take a moment to subscribe and share this show with someone who enjoys studying God's Word. It really helps us continue to bring these complex textual conversations to light.
And before we go, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to ponder this week.
We just spent a significant amount of time talking about how Adam and Eve's one single decision in the garden echoed through 1,000 years of overlapping generations.
Their single choice shaped the reality of great-great-great-grandchildren they never even met.
So I want you to ask yourself, what generational impact are your choices making today on the family tree you are leaving behind?
The quiet faithfulness you practice today might just be the spiritual anchor for a descendant 100 years from now.
This has been Between the Verses,
Where curiosity meets scripture.